familiar with Jeffrey Tucker, I guess by way of introduction, he um, he basically cut his teeth out at the Mises Institute. He revolutionized online, sort of the anti-IP movement of putting economic literature and the great minds online. And if you ever go over to Mises.org, although he's been away for a while, that was Jeffrey's doing. He then moved on to where'd he go? He went to Fee. He brought them into the 21st century. He did the same with AIER, and now he's got his own institute, the Brownstone Institute, which was darn near heroic, depending on where you come down on the pandemic. And he was a thought leader. Really went out on a limb, and he also writes, I think, a column now for the Epic Times. Jeffrey, I bugged you for days now, or months, I should say, trying to get you onto a space. So thanks so much for taking a couple minutes. Give us your hot take here. Powell saw his shadow, and he gave us 50.
Right. So this is a repeat of the 1970s, and it's very sad to me because I've been warning about this for some time. It's a big cut, and we are already starting to see the money stock rising. If you look at M2 for several months now, it's been creeping up and creeping up. Your data shows inflation is quite calm. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's all the $7 trillion that the Fed printed over the last 4 years is squeezed out of the system entirely. This is a tremendous risk to be undertaking such a thing, and it threatens to reignite inflation. My own intuition here, and nobody knows for sure where all this money sloshes around or where it lands and why, but that a lot of it is landed in the financial markets, and that's the kind of inflation everybody really likes.
Right.
It's like when butter, bread, and eggs and gas are going up, people complain, "Oh, it's bad inflation." But when they see their 401ks go up, "Oh, this is a strong economy." That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
But so it's all pick your inflation, right? But there's if you look at the sticky prices, month over month, not Truflation, day over day, but month over month. We're really not in safe territory yet, and there's a number of us who suspect that the Fed has actually changed its targets from 2% to 3%, and they're looking for any excuse to cut. And they've been doing this most of the year, but the macroeconomic data hasn't really cooperated with the Fed until recently, when the weakness in labor markets began to be more obvious. And so, in Keynesian style thinking, fixing labor markets is much harder than fixing anything else. So, the idea of this is a kind of a counter-cyclical move to forestall more problems within the labor sector. But the real risk is that it's just going to ignite more inflation. And by the way, people have disputed this to me recently, and which I find funny. But I don't understand why people are so confused about monetary basics that you can learn from any CFP course or CFA course that you take, but this amounts to a kind of quantitative easing. And that is the new phrase we use for expansion of the money stock to create a kind of an artificial and ultimately unsustainable boom that can have distortive effects on the structure of production, which we can talk about if you want. But one of the real risks of this kinds of thing is that between 12 and 18 months after you embark in such a program, you're going to start seeing responses in the price level depending on where the new money ends up. Now, you can immediately cite 2008 and say, oh, look, there was quantitative easing there. It didn't result in inflation. But that was for specific institutional reasons, that the Fed had this hilarious and actually quite innovative but shocking buyback program where it just basically opened up acres of mattresses and stuffed all the new money in there to recapitalize the banking system, and it didn't end up as hot money on the streets. This time was very different because they used it as the money that was expanded during 2020 and 2021 was dropped like a helicopter on the streets. I mean, it was literally, it gets injected into every business and every individual in the country, um, and we saw at that same time this huge collapse in velocity, which made the price effects a little bit delayed. But the instant the velocity started reversing itself, the prices just went crazy. And, um, it's hard to know exactly how high they went. I mean, there's some estimates that are pretty extreme once you include interest rates in 2023, but including real housing indexes in there and industry data on groceries and used cars and so on. The estimates are quite extreme, and they get us into 1979 realms, really. Um, and that was a direct consequence of the way the money entered into the macroeconomic environment. That contrasted very severely with 2008. It was a different experience entirely. Now, how will it happen? How will this? How will the present quantitative easing, which is what this is, manifest itself? My concern is that we're starting to see real momentum in the velocity of money, which is the pace at which money changes hands. The faster, the higher the velocity, the greater the risk of inflation. The low velocity days of 2000 are long over, and we're entering back into a normal realm. And I'm also not seeing with this announcement anything like the Bernanke, buyback program. So my guess is that this is going to be a push for the money stock to really increase and have real effects, and here's a prediction for you, that whoever wins in November, this time next year, they're going to be dealing with a serious problem of reigniting inflation, which again threatens to repeat the experience of the 1970s. And just as a refresher here, what happened is inflation took off, and then the Fed raised rates and calmed it down, and then celebrated, and then lowered rates, and then inflation took off again. The Fed raised rates, and inflation settled back down again, and then uh, uh, and then everything seemed normal. Inflation went through a third wave. Finally, the bad cop showed up in the form of Paul Volcker, and he raised interest rates several successive times to unfathomable levels we had never seen before, and it finally squeezed all the inflation out of the economy. We went through 40 years of relative price stability as a consequence of that. So, if that history repeats itself, which we're in stage one of that, then we could be seeing two more waves that could get quite grim.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you, not sure how plugged in you are to the goings on and the machinations of the FOMC and the Fed, but I was kind of wondering out loud as you were talking before you hit on Volcker, is there a Volcker among them, do you think?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. In fact, if you think about it, it has been so. What happened in 1981 and 82 is that you had the entire sort of, for lack of a better term, U.S. establishment telling the world, telling the public, that there will be a period of austerity and recession and dislocation and a lot of businesses closing and some high unemployment and some tough times, and that will be necessary to prepare the way for a recovery. That's what the Reagan administration said, and that's what Paul Volcker said, and that's what everybody was saying. It was widely believed that there have been so many distortions over the previous 5 or 10 years that we needed a period of purging, and they were in a rush against the clock because the midterm elections were in 1982. They were devastating for the Republicans, but they held on, and Paul Volcker held on, and with a confidence in that old, Say's law, old style classical economics, which they rechristened supply side economics, which is kind of a dumb term, but that's what they called it. And sure enough, they were right. So by 1983, we started seeing evidence of a lot of recovery and moving into the presidential election in 1984. It was, felt like morning in America again, as they said. I just, it has been 40 years since anyone in the upper reaches of our policymakers has said anything truthful along those lines.
Yeah,
Uh, it's like the culture has fundamentally changed, and now we just take for granted that there must, under no circumstances, ever be a recession. That we can never, ever again tolerate 1, 2, 3 years of a downturn that would be somehow healthy and beneficial. The patient must never be detoxed, basically, and,
that's right.
and I'm afraid that's where we are.
Yeah, and it's to even hear you say it, even though I'm a lot closer to you than maybe perhaps most of the listeners in terms of philosophy. To even hear you say it, the R word, you try to explain to the average folks that no, maybe that's exactly what the economy needs. It's trying to get healthy and kick the habit and get into rehab, so to speak. And like you say, it's just. That's just so much crazy talk. You did mention the election in your X's, your tweets, whatever we're calling them now, and that's what sort of got me to think about it. You're kind of in the weeds there. You think this is, if I can assume here, you think this is all calculated to keep at least one of the candidates out, right?
Uh, yeah, I do think that. I think it's been obvious for a better part of the year. They've just been waiting for an opportunity to cut. So yeah, they're going to present it as macroeconomic countercyclical policies or whatever. But no, I think it's. I mean, the Fed has always been political, and it's preposterous to pretend otherwise. We have a tremendous amount of empirical research on this, and you only have to open your eyes to see what's going on here. I don't think the Fed wants anything to do with, doesn't want Trump. Let's remember too that the Fed really revealed what its job really is. In starting about, I would say, March 10th, 2020, when Powell was on a campaign, had been on a campaign for the better part of a year to fix the great mistake of Bernanke, and he was trying to clean up the Fed's balance sheet and normalize rates, because you can't have this zero interest policy lasting forever, else you end up like Japan. And he knew that. I mean, Powell's not an idiot. But and we don't know what happened behind the scenes. But come time for the pandemic response, and he was all in, and suddenly going against all of his instincts, all of his desires, all of his wishes, everything he ever told anybody at any cocktail party. The rates were back down to zero, and they stayed there for a very, very long time, and he accommodated everything that Congress did. If you recall, back in those days, there was a trillion here, a trillion there, a trillion, another trillion here, a trillion there. Fed was there to buy it all up, and with fresh monetary injections, and make it possible for the U.S. to glide through that experience of without precedent, of completely locking down the economic environment, shutting down small businesses and so on. We all know the incredible dislocations. The thing that made that possible was, of course, the Federal Reserve. So the loyalties really are, and the Fed was founded, with two main clients. One is the banking industry, and the other is the government.
Right, right. And hard to see where one begins and the other ends these days.